Some stories begin with magic and miracles, but Noelle Winter had stopped believing in either the day her parents died. Which made it rather ironic that she was about to save the most powerful shifter in the realm and win a king's heart in return. They say Christmas magic only works if you believe. As it turned out, Noelle's compassion would work without belief at all, melting a warrior king's frozen heart and igniting a love that would save a kingdom. It begins on Christmas Eve, with snow falling like frozen tears over a town square, and a lonely orphan girl about to make a choice that would change everything. The cold bit through Noelle's threadbare cloak as she trudged past the grand Christmas tree in the town square. She clutched the small bundle of mending she'd finished, her last commission before the holidays. The coins would buy enough bread and coal to survive another week, provided she was careful. Around her, families laughed and celebrated. Children squealed as vendors sold roasted chestnuts and spiced cider. Lovers walked hand in hand beneath strings of lanterns that made the falling snow sparkle like diamonds. Noelle kept her head down, moving through the crowd like a ghost. She'd learned long ago that being invisible was safer. The orphan seamstress. The girl with no family, no prospects, no future worth mentioning. Soon the square would empty, everyone returning to warm homes and full tables. And she would return to her cold cottage alone. Just another Christmas, she thought, swallowing against the familiar ache in her chest. But a sound stopped her. Soft, pitiful, almost lost beneath the cheerful noise of the festival. A whimper. Noelle paused, listening. There it was again, coming from beneath the massive Christmas tree that dominated the square's center. Setting her mending bundle down carefully, she pushed through the ring of onlookers admiring the decorations. The tree stood 30 feet tall, its branches heavy with glass ornaments that caught the lantern light. Families had hung wishes and blessings from its boughs, creating a glittering canopy of hope and dreams. But underneath, in the shadows where no one looked, something moved. Noelle dropped to her knees in the snow, peering beneath the lowest branches. Her breath caught. A wolf puppy lay huddled against the tree's trunk, so small he could have fit in her arms. His fur was matted with blood and ice. One tiny paw was twisted wrong, and his breaths came in shallow, desperate gasps. But it was his eyes that undid her, golden eyes that opened briefly, fixing on her face with an awareness that seemed far too ancient for something so small. "Oh," Noelle whispered, heart clenching. "What happened to you?" She reached for him carefully, expecting him to snap or flee. Instead, he whimpered again, a sound of such pure misery that tears pricked her eyes. "Don't touch it." The sharp voice made Noelle jerk back. An older woman stood behind her, face twisted with fear and disgust. "That's one of the cursed wolves," the woman hissed. "Haven't you heard? They've been attacking travelers on the roads. Dark magic, everyone says. Leave it be, girl, before it tears your throat out." Others gathered, murmuring agreement. A man pulled his children away protectively. Someone suggested fetching the guards to deal with it. Noelle looked back at the puppy. He was watching her with those impossible eyes, and in them she saw something she recognized all too well. Loneliness. Pain. The desperate hope that someone, anyone, might care. "He's dying," she said quietly. "Good riddance," someone muttered. Noelle's jaw set. She'd spent years being invisible, being the one everyone overlooked and dismissed. She knew what it felt like to be considered worthless. To be left behind when everyone else had somewhere warm to go. She wouldn't do that to another living thing. Not tonight. Not on Christmas Eve. Without another word, Noelle unwrapped her cloak, her only good possession, the last gift her mother had made before dying, and carefully gathered the puppy into its folds. He was so light, barely there, his small body trembling against her chest. The crowd erupted in protests and warnings. Someone grabbed her arm. "You'll bring a curse on yourself, girl. On all of us." Noelle pulled free, meeting the woman's eyes steadily. "Then I'll bear it alone. Merry Christmas." She turned and walked away, holding the puppy close, feeling his faint heartbeat against her own. The crowd's voices faded behind her as snow began to fall harder, and the festival lights blurred into distant stars. The walk to her cottage on the edge of town had never felt so long. The puppy didn't move, didn't whimper, barely seemed to breathe. Noelle found herself whispering to him, the words tumbling out unbidden. "Hold on. Please, just hold on. You're not dying alone in the cold. I won't let you." She didn't know if he could understand. She didn't know if it mattered. But the words kept coming anyway, filling the silence she'd lived in for so long. "I know what it's like," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "To be unwanted. To be left behind. But you're not unwanted now. I've got you. I promise." By the time she reached her cottage, her fingers were numb and her legs ached from trudging through deepening snow. The blizzard the village elders had warned about was beginning in earnest, wind howling like something alive and angry. Inside, Noelle's home was barely warmer than outside. One room with a small hearth, a narrow bed, a table and chair, shelves for her sewing supplies. Humble. Empty. Hers. She laid the puppy carefully on the rug before the hearth and quickly built up the fire, using precious coal she'd been saving. Once flames crackled to life, she returned to examine her patient. In the firelight, she could see the extent of his injuries. Blood matted his silver white fur along his side. His twisted paw was definitely broken. But it was the wound on his small shoulder that made her stomach clench. The flesh around it had turned black, spreading like ink in water. "What is that?" she breathed, touching the edge gently. The puppy's eyes opened again, fixing on her face. And for just a moment, Noelle could have sworn she saw something flicker in those golden depths. Not animal instinct. Understanding. Gratitude. And something else, something that made her breath catch and her heart skip. Recognition, as if he knew her. As if he'd been waiting for her. Then his eyes closed again, and he was just a dying puppy once more. Noelle shook herself. Exhaustion and loneliness were making her imagine things. She needed to focus on keeping him alive. She worked through the night, using everything she knew from years of tending her own injuries and illnesses. Warm water to clean the wounds. Bandages torn from her spare dress. Herbal poultices her mother had taught her to make before dying. She dripped water into his mouth, wrapped him in blankets, held him close to share her warmth. And as snow piled against her windows and the world disappeared into white, Noelle talked to him. She told him about her parents, how they'd died when she was 12. About the empty years since, working just to survive, invisible and forgotten. About Christmases spent alone, watching other families celebrate what she'd lost. "Everyone has somewhere to belong," she whispered, stroking his soft fur. "Everyone except me. But tonight I'm not alone. And neither are you." The puppy stirred slightly, and she could have sworn he pressed closer to her. A tiny gesture of trust that made her throat tighten. "It's Christmas Eve," she continued softly. "They say it's a night for miracles. I stopped believing in those a long time ago. But maybe you're my miracle. Even if you're small. Even if we only have tonight." She didn't expect him to survive until morning. The black poison spreading from his shoulder looked fatal, and she had no idea how to stop it. But she would stay with him. He wouldn't die alone. Noelle dozed fitfully, waking every hour to check on him, to add wood to the fire, to whisper reassurances into fur that grew steadily warmer. Slowly, impossibly, his breathing seemed to steady. The trembling eased. And though she couldn't be certain, the black poison appeared to stop spreading. Christmas magic, she thought with tired amusement. Or just stubbornness. When she finally fell into deeper sleep just before dawn, she was curled around the puppy protectively, her hand resting on his small head. She didn't see his eyes open in the darkness, golden and aware and very much not a puppy's eyes. She didn't see the faint shimmer of magic that began to glow beneath her palm. And she certainly didn't see the transformation that would begin the moment Christmas morning arrived. But she would wake to it. And nothing would ever be the same again. The fire had burned down to a heap of glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows against the cottage walls as the blizzard rattled the window panes. Noelle sat on the floor, her back against the hearth, the small bundle of fur still nestled in her lap. She worked with a needle and silk thread, not for a commission this time, but to carefully stitch a deep gash on the puppy's flank. Every time she touched the blackened edges of the wound on his shoulder, a cold shiver raced up her arms. It wasn't just an injury, it was a rot that seemed to hum with a low, malevolent energy. Dark magic. She had heard stories of the corruption spreading through the kingdom, but she had never seen it so close. It looked like ink bleeding into the very soul of the creature. "I don't know why they're so afraid of you," she whispered, her voice raspy from the dry heat of the fire. "You're just a tiny thing. How could you be a curse?" The puppy's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. He didn't have the strength to lift his head, but his golden eyes remained fixed on her, tracking every movement of her hands. Noelle found herself talking to fill the heavy silence, the secrets she usually kept locked behind her ribs spilling out into the warmth of the room. She told him about how her mother used to say that every stitch in a garment was a prayer for the person wearing it. She told him about the years she had spent hungry, watching the town's elite draped in the very silks she had spent weeks sewing, never once receiving a thank you or even a glance. "To them, I'm just a tool," she said, a stray tear escaping and splashing onto her hand. "A needle with legs. If I disappeared tomorrow, they'd only be upset that their ball gowns weren't finished." As the tear hit her skin, the puppy did something that stopped her breath. With agonizing slowness, he reached out his small, uninjured front paw and rested it against her wrist. Then, he leaned forward and softly licked the salt from her hand. His tongue was warm, his gaze so intense and focused that Noelle felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt of electricity shoot through her. In that moment, the loneliness that had been her constant companion for years seemed to pull back, replaced by a strange, humming heat. The puppy shifted, burrowing his head into the crook of her arm, and Noelle felt a wave of peace wash over her. It was as if the magic of Christmas Eve had finally found her cottage, wrapping her in a sense of hope she hadn't felt since she was a child. She meant to stay awake, to keep the fire fed and the bandages fresh, but the exhaustion was a physical weight. As the first gray light of Christmas morning began to bleed through the frost on the windows, Noelle drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, her arms still protectively wrapped around the small creature. She woke to the sensation of being crushed. The small, light weight she had fallen asleep holding had been replaced by something massive and radiating an incredible, furnace-like heat. Noelle blinked, her vision blurred by sleep, and realized she wasn't on the rug anymore. She was on her narrow bed, and her arms were no longer draped over a handful of fur. They were wrapped around a broad, muscular chest. She gasped, scrambling backward until her back hit the cold stone of the wall. Lying in her bed was a man. He was huge, his frame nearly overflowing the small cot, his skin bronzed and marked by jagged silver scars that looked like lightning strikes. His hair was the color of midnight, falling in messy waves over a face that was both terrifyingly beautiful and undeniably regal. He was naked, save for the green wool cloak she had used as a blanket, which now looked absurdly small draped across his waist. The man's eyes snapped open. They were the same impossible gold as the puppy's, glowing with a fierce, predatory intelligence. He sat up with a sudden, fluid grace that spoke of immense power, despite the way he winced, his hand going instinctively to the blackened wound on his shoulder. He looked at his hands, then at the room, and finally, his gaze settled on Noelle. For a long heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The air in the tiny cottage felt charged, thick with the scent of pine, ozone, and something ancient. Noelle's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She should have been screaming, should have been running for the door, but she couldn't move. There was a tether between them, a sense of recognition so profound it felt like her own soul was leaning toward him. The man opened his mouth, his throat working as if he were trying to remember how to form human words. His voice, when it came, was a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to shake the floorboards. "You stayed." "I promised," Noelle managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "I promised you wouldn't be alone." A flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps, or a deep, aching sorrow, crossed the man's face. He started to reach out a hand toward her, his fingers long and calloused, but the gesture was cut short. Boom. 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 The sound of heavy fists pounding on her door shattered the fragile silence. The small cottage shuddered under the force of the blows. "Open up, seamstress," a harsh, metallic voice barked from the other side. "By order of the High Guard and Lady Isolde, open this door. We know you're harboring dark magic. Surrender the beast, or we'll burn the house down with you inside." The man's eyes darkened, the gold turning to the color of molten suns. He looked at the door, then back at Noelle, his jaw tightening with a grim, lethal resolve. "It seems," he rasped, "your act of mercy has come with a price." The door didn't just open, it splintered under the force of a heavy boot. Noelle stumbled back, her heart leaping into her throat as three men in the silver and blue livery of the High Guard surged into the small room. Their swords were drawn, the steel gleaming coldly in the morning light. They stopped dead at the sight of the massive, scarred man standing in the center of the cottage, his body partially draped in a tattered green cloak, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the air itself feel heavy. "Step away from her," the lead guard commanded, though his voice wavered as his gaze swept over the man's powerful frame and the jagged silver scars that seemed to hum with suppressed power. "We were told a beast was brought here. This is worse. Who are you, stranger?" Despite his obvious weakness, the man stepped in front of Noelle, shielding her with his own body. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest, a sound that was more animal than human. "She has done nothing," he rasped, his voice like grinding stone. "If you touch her, I will tear the life from your bodies." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a hair flicker away from a bloodbath, when a voice cut through the chaos from the doorway. "Easy now, boys. Put the steel away before someone loses a hand." A man Noelle recognized as Toby, a street merchant who often sold trinkets near the town square, pushed his way into the cottage. He looked harried and wind-blown, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He stepped between the guards and the bed, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "This is my cousin, Silas. He's a bit rough around the edges, sure, but he's no dark mage. He got into a scrap with a mountain cat 3 days ago, and I paid Noelle to look after him while I fetched supplies. You know her, she's the best seamstress and healer in the district. She's just doing her job." The guards looked from Toby to the imposing figure of Silas, then to the trembling Noelle. Suspicion clung to them like the winter frost. "We heard reports of a wolf pup," the lead guard muttered, though he slowly sheathed his sword. "A mangy dog I found on the road," Toby lied smoothly, gesturing to the blood-stained rags on the floor. "The poor thing died an hour ago. Noelle was just helping Silas into bed when you lot decided to play hero. Now, unless you're planning on paying for that door, I suggest you go back to the square. Lady Isolde's parade is starting, and I'm sure she'd love to hear why her guards were busy harassing a lonely orphan on Christmas morning." Mentioning Lady Isolde worked like a charm. The guards grumbled, casting one last wary look at Silas's glowing golden eyes, before retreating back into the snow. Toby followed them just far enough to ensure they were gone before slamming the broken door shut and bracing it with a chair. He turned back to the room, his expression shifting from jovial merchant to grim soldier in an instant. Noelle sank into her chair, her legs finally giving out. She looked at the man, Silas, and then at Toby. He was a puppy," she whispered, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between the small creature she'd held and the man now leaning heavily against her table. Silas sank onto a stool, his face pale as the magic that had sustained his transformation began to flag. "I am a shifter," he admitted, his golden eyes meeting hers with a raw, painful honesty. "I was ambushed, poisoned with a rot that strips the soul. It forced me into my most vulnerable form to survive. I didn't mean to bring this danger to your door." "I don't care what you are," Noelle said, her voice gaining strength as she looked at the wounds she had spent the night tending. "You were dying. You needed help. That's all that mattered." Silas froze, his gaze searching her face. He had spent his life in a court of vipers, where every act of kindness was a transaction and every smile was a blade. He looked at the humble cottage, the threadbare blankets, and the empty larder she had tried to hide. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why save something the rest of the world called a monster? You have nothing, Noelle Winter. Why give what little you have to a stranger?" "Because something deserved to live when so much in this kingdom has died," she replied simply. She stood up, moving to the stove to check the small pot of water she'd been heating. "I know what it's like to be discarded. To be seen as something that doesn't matter. I wasn't going to let you be another ghost." Silas watched her, his chest tightening with an emotion more potent than the poison in his veins. He looked toward the corner where she kept her meager supplies and realized with a jolt of guilt that the bowl of broth she had fed him as a puppy was the last of her food. She had gone hungry so he could have strength. In that moment, the alpha in him, the part of him that ruled and protected, roared to life. He vowed silently that he would repay this girl with a treasury of gold, but more than that, he would give her the one thing she lacked, a reason to never be invisible again. "Get some rest," Noelle said, oblivious to his inner turmoil. "Just get strong and go home to whoever is waiting for you. I'm sure they're worried sick." Silas's expression darkened, a profound loneliness reflecting in his eyes. "There is no one waiting," he said. "The people I trusted were the ones who put that poison in my shoulder." Noelle paused, her hand resting on the back of his chair. For a heartbeat, the seamstress and the shifter were 2 points of the same star, both cast out, both alone in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the season. The air between them grew warm again, not with magic, but with a burgeoning attraction that made Noelle's pulse quicken. Toby cleared his throat, breaking the spell. He stepped toward Silas, his voice dropping into a low, urgent tone that Noelle wasn't meant to hear. "My king, we have a problem," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the window. "Lady Isolde hasn't just assumed command in your absence. She's issued a formal decree. She's declaring you legally dead in 3 days' time, on the night of the Christmas ball, unless you reveal yourself. If the moon rises on that night and you aren't on the throne, the crown passes to her permanently." Silas's jaw set, his eyes flashing like molten gold. "And there's more," Toby continued, his face pale. "I've found the ledger. Someone has been embezzling massive amounts from the treasury, gold meant for the border wards. The magic is failing because the money is gone. I think Isolde is funding an army of her own. If we don't move soon, there won't be a kingdom left to save." The days that followed were a blurred tapestry of domesticity and dread. Silas remained confined to the small cottage, his massive frame making the single room feel even smaller, though he refused to be idle. Despite the lingering poison that occasionally turned his veins to ice, he took over the heavy labor Noelle had performed alone for years. She watched through the window as he chopped wood, the rhythmic swing of the axe showcasing the terrifying strength hidden beneath his scarred skin. When he came back inside, smelling of pine and cold air, the cottage seemed to vibrate with his presence. He wasn't just a warrior, he was surprisingly adept at the quiet tasks of a home. He helped her stir the meager stews she prepared, his large hands dwarfing the wooden spoon, and he insisted on teaching her how to defend herself. "If I am not here," he whispered one evening, his hands guiding hers as she gripped a heavy kitchen knife, "you must know where to strike. Do not aim for the chest, aim for the joints, the throat, the eyes." The proximity was agonizing, his chest was a wall of heat against her back, and his breath stirred the loose hairs at her temple. Noelle felt a spark of something dangerous and beautiful ignite in her chest, a physical awareness that made her hands tremble. Toby, or Brennan, as Silas called him when they thought she wasn't listening, arrived every evening under the cover of darkness. The news was never good. "The treasury is bone dry," Brennan reported, his face etched with worry. "Isolde is hosting feasts for the high lords while the border villages are being picked clean by corrupted packs. She's buying loyalty with the gold that was supposed to keep the kingdom's magic alive." Noelle listened from the corner where she sat mending a traveler's cloak. "No one talks to the seamstress," she said suddenly, interrupting their low-voiced strategy. "But they talk around me. The ladies at the manor are whispering about a shipment of silver-tipped spears arriving at the north gate. They aren't meant for the enemy, they're meant for the wolves in the city." Silas turned to her, his brow furrowed. This is dangerous, Noelle. You shouldn't be listening to such things. I'm invisible, Silas, she countered, her voice steady. I've spent my life being the person who hands over a dress and disappears. I can go where you and Brennan can't. I can find out where she's hiding the ledger. I won't have you risking your life for a crown that isn't yours, Silas growled, but Noelle saw the flicker of respect in his eyes. That night, the cold became unbearable as the blizzard redoubled its efforts. Silas had insisted on sleeping on the floor by the hearth, but Noelle saw him shivering as the fire died down. The floor is stone and ice, she said, pulling back the corner of her thin quilt. I won't have you freezing to death in my home after I worked so hard to save you. There's room. Silas hesitated, then climbed into the narrow bed beside her. They lay in the darkness, inches apart, the only sound the howling wind outside. I've spent my entire life being what everyone else needed me to be, Silas whispered into the shadows. A general, a judge, a shield. I've never just been myself. I don't even know who that man is anymore. Noelle turned on her side, her gaze catching the golden glint of his eyes in the dark. And I've spent my life being no one. Sometimes I wonder if that's easier. No one expects anything from a ghost. You're not a ghost, Noelle, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. He reached out, his calloused thumb grazing her jawline. You're the only person who has ever looked at me and seen a man instead of a throne. You're not no one. Not to me. The space between them vanished. Noelle leaned in, her heart hammering against her ribs, her eyes fluttering shut as she felt the warmth of his lips just a hair's breadth from hers. The moment was shattered by the sound of glass exploding. A heavy stone wrapped in a burning rag sailed through the window, crashing onto the table. Before Noelle could scream, the door was kicked off its hinges. Two masked men surged into the room, their blades coated in the same black oil that had poisoned Silas. Get down! Silas roared. He didn't have his sword, but he didn't need it. He met the first attacker with a savagery that took Noelle's breath away, his fists hitting like iron sledges. Noelle scrambled toward the hearth, her fingers closing around the heavy iron fire poker. As the second assassin lunged at Silas's exposed back, she didn't think, she swung. The iron crunched against the man's temple, and he crumpled into a heap. Silas finished the first man, snapping his neck with a sickening crack, and then grabbed Noelle, pulling her toward the back door. We have to go. Now. They burst out into the freezing night just as Brennan arrived, his own sword drawn and bloodied. My king. They've found us. Isolde's scouts tracked the scent of the poison. They know you're alive. They ran into the tree line, the cottage beginning to burn behind them, the orange flames licking at the falling snow. When they finally reached a small cave deeper in the woods, Silas turned to Noelle. His face was streaked with soot and blood, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, regal light. I haven't been honest with you, he said, his voice echoing in the small cavern. I told you I was a soldier, and I am. But I am also Silas Vane, the Alpha King. And I think you're in danger because of me. Isolde doesn't just want me dead anymore, Noelle. She wants you, because you're the only one who can prove her a traitor. Noelle looked back toward the glow of her burning home, the only thing she had ever owned. She looked at the man who was her king, and the man who had almost kissed her. The fear was there, cold and sharp, but beneath it, a new fire was beginning to burn. Then we'd better make sure she doesn't get the chance, she said, her voice like tempered steel. Show me how to fight, Silas. All the way. The cave smelled of damp stone and the metallic tang of blood. Noelle stood near the mouth of the cavern, watching the distant orange glow of her cottage as it surrendered to the flames. Everything she had ever owned, her mother's sewing kits, the hearth she had scrubbed, the only life she knew, was turning to ash. She turned back toward the man she had called Silas, but he looked different now in the flickering shadows, his presence expanding until he seemed to fill the entire space. The Alpha King, she repeated, the words feeling heavy and wrong on her tongue. You've been lying to me this whole time? Silas stepped toward her, his golden eyes filled with a desperate, raw honesty. I wanted you to know me as a man, Noelle. Not as a crown, not as a general, but as the person who sat at your table and watched you work. Noelle recoiled, her back hitting the cold stone. The intimacy of the previous nights, the shared quilt, the heat of his breath, the almost kiss, suddenly felt like a cruel performance. This changes everything, she whispered, her voice cracking. You're the king. You're the sovereign of the realm I barely survive in. And I'm nobody. I'm a seamstress with threadbare sleeves and nothing to my name. You saved my life when the rest of the world wanted me dead, Silas growled, his voice vibrating with the low rumble that always made her pulse skip. That makes you everything. To the kingdom and to me. Brennan cleared his throat, stepping into the light with a grim expression. My king, there is no time for this. The treason runs deeper than we feared. He looked at Noelle, his eyes hard. Lady Isolde didn't just stumble into power. She's been planning this coup for years. She was the one who procured the soul-rot poison, intending to kill Silas in his most vulnerable form so she could claim the throne without a struggle. She's been embezzling from the treasury, Noelle, Silas added, his jaw tightening. The gold meant for the border wards, the magic that keeps the corrupted packs at bay, it's all gone. She's inviting enemy forces in, planning to solidify her rule by marrying the enemy king once I am declared legally dead. But we can't prove the treason yet, Brennan warned. The lords follow the ledger and the law. We need physical evidence of her dealings with the enemy, or the High Guard will stay loyal to her. Noelle felt a strange, cold humming in her fingertips, a sensation she had attributed to the freezing winter air. I can get it, she said, her voice shaking but determined. I told you, I'm invisible. I can move through the palace as a servant. They moved toward the town under the cover of the morning mist, intending to meet a contact near the market. The square was bustling with preparations for the Christmas ball, but the air felt thin and brittle. Suddenly, a man in a dark cloak detached himself from the crowd, a blade coated in shimmering black oil clutched in his hand. He lunged not at Noelle, but at Silas's exposed side, where the poison wound was still knitting shut. No! Noelle screamed. She didn't reach for a knife or the fire poker she had used before. She simply threw her hands out, driven by a primal need to protect the man who had seen her as more than a ghost. An explosion of brilliant silver light erupted from her palms. It wasn't the soft glow of a lantern, it was a violent, blinding flare that roared through the square. The attacker was lifted off his feet, blasted across the cobblestones by a concussive wave of pure energy until he hit a stone fountain and crumpled. The market fell into a deathly silence. Merchants dropped their wares, children stopped laughing. Everyone stared at the orphaned seamstress standing in the center of the square, her hands still smoking with a faint, ethereal frost. Noelle looked at her hands, her breath coming in panicked gasps. What am I?" she whispered, the silver light retreating beneath her skin like a dying ember. Silas moved to her side, his touch surprisingly gentle as he took her wrists. "You're a winter mage, Noelle," he said softly, his golden eyes reflecting her terror. The last of a bloodline thought extinguished. "Your parents weren't just commoners, they were the kingdom's protectors." Noelle shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "No. My parents were killed by wolves. I was told, the village elders said they were attacked on the road." Brennan stepped forward, his voice heavy with regret. "They were murdered by the same conspiracy that tried to kill the king, Noelle. They were the only ones powerful enough to sense the rot growing in the court. They stood in the way, so they were removed. The story of the wolves was a lie to keep you from ever looking for the power you inherited." Her world shattered. The years of hunger, the freezing nights, the invisibility, it hadn't been bad luck, it had been a prison built of lies. She looked at the people who had ignored her for a decade, now cowering in fear of the magic she didn't understand. Well, a sharp, melodic voice cut through the crowd. Lady Isolde stepped forward, her silver and blue silks shimmering, her guards fanning out behind her. She began to applaud slowly, a cruel smile twisting her perfect features. The lost winter air, Isolde purred, her eyes scanning Noelle with predatory delight. I wondered if that spark would ever catch fire. It's a pity. Guards, arrest her for practicing dark magic without a license. It seems our little seamstress has been harboring more than just a stray dog. The silver light had barely faded from Noelle's palms before the trap snapped shut. Lady Isolde stepped forward, her smile as sharp as a glass shard, gesturing toward the charred remains of the cottage. It seems our humble seamstress has been busy, Isolde declared, her voice carrying across the silent market square. Two guards stepped forward, holding up a collection of jagged obsidian shards and a vial of the same black, soul-wrought oil that had nearly ended Silas's life. We found these artifacts of dark magic hidden in her home. She hasn't been healing the sick, she's been the one corrupting our defenses from within. Noelle's heart plummeted as the crowd, once her neighbors, erupted in a chorus of fearful shouts and accusations. She looked desperately toward the shadows of a nearby alley where Silas stood. His golden eyes were wide with a raw, agonizing fury, his hand gripped the hilt of a stolen sword until his knuckles turned white. He took a half-step forward, the air around him beginning to shimmer with the power of a king about to reclaim his throne. But Brennan caught his arm, his voice a low, urgent hiss that Noelle could almost feel across the distance. If you reveal yourself now, she'll claim you're a magical construct created by her dark arts. We have no proof of the treasury theft yet. You'll be executed alongside her. We have to wait for the ball. Silas froze, his gaze locked on Noelle as the guards roughly caught her arms, twisting them behind her back. She searched his face for a command, for a roar of defiance, for anything that would stop the cold iron shackles from snapping around her wrists. Instead, he stayed in the shadows, his face a mask of stone. As they dragged her away, the betrayal felt sharper than the cold. He's the king, she thought, her vision blurring with tears. He has the power of the gods in his veins, and he's letting them take me. The dungeons of the capital were a labyrinth of damp stone and the smell of ancient despair. Noelle was tossed into a cell where the only light came from a single, high slit in the masonry. She sat on the freezing floor, her hands still tingling with the dormant silver magic she didn't know how to call back. Hours bled into days, marked only by the change of the guard and the growing cold. They say the Alpha King is alive, she heard a guard murmur one evening, his voice echoing in the corridor. Toby the merchant is spreading rumors. If he's alive, why isn't he stopping Isolde from executing the girl? She's scheduled for the block the morning after the ball. Noelle leaned her head against the weeping stone wall. The guard's words confirmed her darkest fear. Maybe she had just been a tool to him, a convenient hiding place for a wounded predator. He had promised she wasn't a ghost, but here she was, fading away in the dark while he played at politics and strategy. Yet, when she closed her eyes, she didn't see a king, she saw the dying puppy who had licked the salt from her hand. She felt the heat of his chest against her back in the cottage and the way he had looked at her as if she were the only light in a dark world. I saved him, she whispered to the darkness. Even if he never comes, I'll die knowing I saved the only thing worth saving in this kingdom. Deep within the palace, Silas was a caged storm. He paced the small safe house Brennan had secured, his every movement radiating a lethal energy. I won't sacrifice her for a strategy, Brennan, he growled, the sound vibrating the floorboards. She's in that hole because of me. Every hour she spends in the dark is a stain on my crown. If we move too soon, Isolde burns the ledger and flees to the enemy king, Brennan countered, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man fighting a war on two fronts. The king's memorial ball is in 3 days. Isolde has invited the High Lords to witness her final ascension. That is where we catch her. That is where we show the realm who the true traitor is. Noelle is a winter mage, Silas. She's stronger than you think. I will get her out before the first toast is poured. Trust me. The night of the ball arrived with a blizzard that mirrored the one that had brought Silas to Noelle's door. High above, the palace glowed with 1,000 lanterns, music drifting down to the silent, starving city. In her cell, Noelle had lost track of time. She was prepared for the end, her spirit worn thin by the silence. The heavy iron door groaned on its hinges. Noelle didn't look up, expecting the executioner's guard. Instead, a familiar, harried figure stepped into the dim light. Brennan didn't say a word, he simply knelt and began picking the lock on her shackles. "Time to save a kingdom, milady," he whispered as the iron fell away with a heavy clang. Hope, fragile and bright, flickered in Noelle's chest. She stood on shaking legs, her eyes finding Brennan's in the dark. "He sent you?" Brennan paused, his expression solemn as he handed her a bundle of fine, silver-spun silk, a gown far more beautiful than anything she had ever sewn for the ladies of the town. "I need you to know, the king never abandoned you. He's been setting a trap for 3 days, and every second of it has been agony for him. But he knows what a soul doesn't. He knows you're the key to everything." The stone walls of the dungeon seemed to bleed cold as Brennan led Noelle through a series of narrow, forgotten passages that smelled of damp earth and ancient pine. He moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow, pushing aside tapestries and sliding stone panels that had likely not moved in a century. As they navigated the labyrinthine gut of the palace, Brennan spoke in a low, urgent tone, laying out the precarious reality of their situation. He showed her a heavy, leather-bound ledger he had tucked beneath his cloak, the physical proof of Isolde's embezzlement and her secret pacts with enemy kings. "The ledger is enough to ruin her reputation, but it isn't enough to stop the army she's built in the shadows," Brennan whispered, his eyes darting to the flickering torches on the walls. "For the High Lords to turn on her completely, we need her to act. She has to try to kill Silas in front of witnesses. She has to reveal the monster beneath the silk." Noelle felt the weight of the silver-spun gown Brennan had provided, a garment that felt like a second skin, yet she knew it wouldn't be her armor tonight. Instead, she pulled a rough, woolen servant's cloak over it, hiding the finery. Her instructions were simple: blend in, stay near the periphery, and keep her eyes on the massive Christmas tree that dominated the ballroom. Before they reached the final door to the kitchens, Brennan stopped and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Silas wanted me to tell you something," he said, his voice softening. "He said he never stopped believing in you. Not for a single heartbeat." Noelle swallowed the lump in her throat, the memory of his golden eyes in the dark cottage nearly undoing her resolve. "Tell him to stay alive," she managed to say, her voice steadying with a new, fierce determination. "I have things to say to him. Many things." Entering the ballroom through the servants' entrance was like stepping into a dream constructed of ice and light. The air was thick with the scent of spiced cider and the sound of 100 violins, a jarring contrast to the silence of the cells. Massive ice sculptures of wolves stood guard around the perimeter, and the Christmas tree, a 30-foot Titan heavy with glass ornaments, glowed with a light that seemed almost too bright to be natural. At the far end of the hall, the crowd erupted into a roar that shook the very foundations of the palace. Noelle stood on her tiptoes, peering through the sea of noble finery to the dais. There, sitting upon the obsidian throne, was Silas. He was magnificent, draped in royal regalia of midnight blue and silver, the crown of the Alpha King resting upon his brow. Every inch of him radiated a power so ancient and absolute that the nobles bowed instinctively as they passed. Yet, even as he accepted their hollow tributes, his golden eyes didn't rest on the lords or the ladies. They scanned the crowd with a restless, predatory intensity, searching for a face that didn't belong in a palace. Noelle leaned against a marble pillar, her heart breaking in the shadows. She was just a girl in a servant's cloak, invisible as she had always been, and in this sea of gold and silk, she feared he would never find her. The celebration was cut short as Lady Isolde took the stage, her presence chilling the room faster than the winter wind outside. She raised a hand for silence, her silver silk shimmering like a snake's scales. "Before we celebrate our king's miraculous return, there is a matter of justice that must be addressed," she declared, her voice ringing with a false, practiced solemnity. She pointed toward the center of the room, and the guards Noelle had seen in the market stepped forward, holding aloft the obsidian shards and the blackened oil. "This girl, this seamstress, was found harboring dark magic," Isolde cried, her eyes flashing with a manic light. "She has been corrupting the very wards that protect our borders, using the king's own weakness to weave a curse around his heart." The nobles gasped, a ripple of fear and disgust turning the room's warmth into a biting frost. Noelle saw Silas's hands grip the arms of the throne, his knuckles turning white as he was forced to remain still. To save the kingdom from civil unrest, he had to play the part, he had to agree to a trial, even as his eyes burned with a lethal promise. The guards moved into the crowd, dragging Noelle forward. Her hands were bound once more, and as they paraded her past the great Christmas tree, her emerging magical senses began to tingle with a sharp, electric warning. The air near the tree didn't smell of pine, it smelled of ozone and rot. She looked closer at the glass ornaments, and her breath hitched. Inside the spheres of light, she saw the same black, swirling poison that had nearly claimed Silas's life, vibrating with a malevolent energy. Realization hit her like a physical blow. The tree wasn't a decoration, it was a weapon of mass destruction. Isolde didn't just want to kill Silas, she intended to trigger the poison and wipe out every noble, every guard, and the king himself in a single, catastrophic burst of dark magic. Terror gripped her, but beneath it, the silver light in her veins began to hum with a desperate, protective heat. Noelle looked up, her gaze finally meeting Silas's across the distance. In that moment, Isolde saw the recognition in Noelle's eyes. She realized the invisible girl had seen through the grand design. A cold, jagged smile stretched across Isolde's face as she reached for the glowing star atop the lowest branch, her fingers twitching with the desire to trigger the end early. The glass star beneath Lady Isolde's fingers didn't just glow, it fractured. A hissed command in a language that sounded like grinding stones tore from her throat, and instantly, the vibrant green of the great tree began to wither. From the hundreds of ornaments, a thick, violet-black mist began to pour, heavy and cloying. It didn't rise, it sank, rolling over the floor like a physical weight. The screaming began almost immediately. Nobles clutched their throats, their fine silks fluttering as they collapsed. Guards in the periphery fell like harvested wheat, their eyes rolling back as the soul-wrought poison began its work. The tree. Noelle's voice cracked through the panic, a desperate clarion call. It's poisoned. Get away from the tree. Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a trial or a parley. With a roar that shattered the remaining windows of the ballroom, the Alpha King's body surged and expanded. The fine royal regalia tore away as silver gray fur erupted, muscle and bone snapping into a new, terrifyingly magnificent shape. In his place stood a wolf the size of a warhorse, his golden eyes burning with a celestial light. The crowd fell back in a mixture of awe and primal terror. The king was no longer a man, he was the apex of his bloodline. Isolde threw her head back and laughed, a sound that shifted into a sickening sloughing of skin. You should have stayed dead, my king, she shrieked. Her body didn't shift into a wolf, it lengthened, her limbs melting into a massive, undulating serpent form made of living shadow and jagged ice. She towered over the chaos, her scales clicking like frozen knives. With a flick of her tail, she shattered the ice sculptures, and from the shards, corrupted wolves, monsters with glowing red eyes and rotting flesh, emerged to prowl the ballroom. I will take what should have been mine. This kingdom will burn in the cold. The ballroom became a slaughterhouse of magic and steel. Silas threw himself into the fray, a blur of silver fury, his jaws snapping shut on the throats of the corrupted wolves that tried to reach the fleeing children. Beta Brennan and a handful of loyalists drew their blades, forming a desperate circle around the remaining nobles, clashing against Isolde's conspirators who had drawn hidden daggers. Noelle stood paralyzed near the base of the dying tree. The mist was rising, curling around her ankles like oily snakes. She saw the carnage, the blood on the marble, the desperate light in the eyes of the people who had once looked down on her. I can't do this, she whispered, her hands shaking so violently she had to clutch her chest. I'm just a seamstress. I don't know how to be a hero. Amidst the cacophony, Silas lunged over a fallen table, pinning a corrupted wolf to the floor. For a heartbeat, he shifted back into his human form, his chest heaving, blood matting his shoulder. He locked eyes with Noelle across the clearing mist. The tree, Noelle. You have to purify it. The poison is anchored to the star. I can't. Noelle screamed back, tears carving tracks through the soot on her face. I'm not strong enough. I don't know the spells. You saved a dying king on Christmas Eve with nothing but a needle and a kind heart. Silas roared, his voice filled with a conviction that pierced through her terror. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Believe in the light you carry. With a final, desperate look, he shifted back into the great wolf and leaped into the path of Isolde's shadow serpent, taking a blow intended for Brennan. Noelle looked at the tree. It was a 30-foot mountain of dying wood and lethal glass. The poison mist burned her skin as she approached, a cold fire that made her lungs ache. She grabbed the first branch. The needles were sharp, coated in the black oil that sizzled against her palms. She pulled herself up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The climb was a descent into a private hell. Ornaments exploded around her as the pressure of the dark magic grew, the glass shards cutting her cheeks and arms. Every branch felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The voices in her head, the ones that had lived there since she was an orphan in the streets, screamed at her. You're a nobody. You're a ghost. You'll fail, and everyone will die because you dared to think you were special. Halfway up, her foot slipped on a slick, oil-covered bough. She plummeted, her heart leaping into her throat, until her fingers caught a jagged branch. She hung there, dangling over the chaos. Below, she saw Silas pinned beneath the shadow serpent's coils, his silver fur stained crimson. She saw Brennan struggling against 3 men. She saw a child huddled under a table, clutching a small wooden toy. In the silence of her own mind, she remembered her parents, not as the victims the village spoke of, but as the protectors they truly were. She remembered the puppy's eyes beneath her small, pathetic tree in the cottage, trusting her to keep him safe when he had no one else. I am Noelle Winter, she whispered, her voice growing until it was a vow. Daughter of heroes. And I choose love. The fear didn't vanish, but it transformed. It became a fuel. She climbed faster, ignoring the glass in her skin and the poison in her lungs. The silver light in her veins wasn't a spark anymore, it was a conflagration. She reached the summit, her fingers brushing the cold, black-veined glass of the star at the peak. Noelle placed both hands on the star, the dark magic fighting to push her off the tree. She closed her eyes, thinking of the hearth she had lost and the king she had found. Let love protect those who cannot protect themselves, she cried out. When Noelle's palms pressed against the blackened star, the world didn't shatter with a roar, it exhaled. The light that erupted from her was not the violent, searing silver of the market square, but a warm, radiant gold that felt like the first breath of a spring morning. It began as a small spark in the center of the star and then cascaded downward in shimmering waves, looking less like a magical explosion and more like the arrival of Christmas morning itself. It was the color of sunrise on fresh snow, of hope rekindled in the dead of winter. The purification was instantaneous. Where the golden light touched the oily, violet mist, the poison didn't just dissipate, it burned away into sweet-smelling ozone. The corrupted wolves that had been tearing through the ballroom froze. Their red, glowing eyes flickered, the madness draining from them until their gaze cleared, revealing the confused spirits of shifters who had been enslaved by shadow. As one, the healed wolves slumped onto their bellies, bowing their heads toward Silas in a silent, profound acknowledgement of their true alpha. Lady Isolde let out a piercing, jagged scream as the shadow serpent began to wither. The jagged ice scales melted into gray slush, and the towering silhouette of the monster shrank rapidly. Within seconds, the formidable sorceress was reduced to a shivering woman huddled on the marble floor, her dark magic stripped away by a purity she could not comprehend. Above her, the great tree didn't just return to life, it bloomed. The withered needles turned a vibrant, emerald green, and the glass ornaments transformed into vessels of ancient blessings. A sense of profound peace washed over the room, healing the shallow wounds of the guards and soothing the panicked hearts of the nobles. But the cost was absolute. As the final wave of light left Noelle's body, the strength in her limbs turned to water. The world began to tilt and dim, the golden glow fading into a gray haze. She felt herself slip from the peak of the tree, falling through the air like a discarded ribbon. She never hit the ground. A massive, warm weight intercepted her fall, and she felt the soft brush of silver fur before the world shifted. By the time she blinked her eyes open, Silas was human again, his regal features etched with a terror she had never seen before. He was cradling her against his bare chest, his hands trembling as he brushed the hair from her face. "Noelle. Noelle, stay with me," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended his crown. "Open your eyes, please." Nearby, the chaos of battle had shifted into the cold efficiency of justice. Brennan and the Loyalists had already seized the powerless Isolde, who was raging and spitting curses even as the iron shackles clicked into place. Brennan stood before the assembled nobles, holding the ledger high. "The evidence of her treason is absolute," he declared, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "She embezzled your taxes, weakened your wards, and attempted to slaughter you all tonight. She is no longer of this court. Execute her," a lord cried out, and a chorus of voices rose in agreement. Silas looked up, his golden eyes cold and authoritative. "No," he commanded, and the room fell silent. "Lock her in the deepest dungeon beneath the frost wards. She will face a public trial and the full weight of the kingdom's law. I will not start this new era with a shadow execution." Noelle stirred, her vision finally clearing. She saw the high vaulted ceilings of the palace, the glittering tree, and then Silas, looking down at her as if she were the only thing in the room that mattered. She realized the entire court was watching them in a heavy, expectant silence. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She tried to sit up, her face flushing. "I'm just a seamstress. I should get out of your way." "Don't," Silas said firmly, holding her closer. "Don't you dare apologize. You didn't just save my life, Noelle. You saved the soul of this kingdom." He stood, lifting her with him and helping her find her footing on the marble, though he kept a steadying arm around her waist. He turned to face the hundreds of nobles, his voice rising with the resonance of a true king. "This woman," he said, indicating Noelle, "saved my life on the coldest night of the year when I was nothing but a dying beast. She took me in, fed me, and protected me when I had no throne to offer her. And tonight, she saved every soul in this room from a darkness you couldn't even see." He looked at Brennan, who nodded, and then back to the crowd. "She is Noelle Winter, the last daughter of the Winter Mages, the lineage that gave their lives to protect this realm. And she is more than that." He turned to her, his gaze softening into something private and beautiful. "The magic itself chose her. She is my true mate." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. To have the Alpha King find his fated mate was a legend of old, to have it be the girl who had just purified the palace was a miracle. Silas took her hand, his thumb grazing her knuckles. "Noelle Winter," he said, loud enough for every ear to hear. "I want you by my side. Not as a subject to be protected, and not just as a mage of the court. I want you as my queen. If you'll have me, I promise that you will never be invisible again." Tears streamed down Noelle's cheeks, hot and thick. She looked at her scarred hands, the hands of a worker, a seamstress, a survivor. "Silas. I'm nobody. I have nothing to give a king." "You are my everything," he countered, his eyes burning with golden fire. "Say yes." Noelle let out a sob that turned into a laugh, her heart finally letting go of the years of loneliness. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "yes. Always yes." When he pulled her into a kiss, the magic of the Christmas tree seemed to respond, swirling around them in a vortex of silver and gold light that felt like a warm embrace. The ballroom erupted into cheers, a roar of genuine joy that drowned out the winter wind outside. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom transformed. Isolde remained behind bars, her influence withering as the truth of her crimes spread. The corrupted wolves, once feared monsters, were integrated back into their packs, their minds healed and their loyalty returned to the crown. With Noelle's guidance and the help of the royal mages, the ancient barriers of the kingdom were restored, woven with a new kind of magic, one born of compassion rather than just power. Noelle no longer wore threadbare cloaks. She spent her days in the library, learning to wield the winter light that lived in her blood, and her evenings by the hearth with the man who had once been her puppy under the tree. Every year from that day forward, Christmas was declared a kingdom-wide celebration, not just of royalty or magic, but of the simple, world-changing power of kindness. The seamstress who had been a ghost had become the light of the realm, and the king who had been a beast had finally found his home. The bells of the cathedral rang with a clarity that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the capital. It was Christmas Eve once more, but the atmosphere was a world away from the desperate, freezing silence of the year before. Today, the air was thick with the scent of pine and the joyous roar of 1,000 voices. Inside the great hall, the light of 10,000 candles reflected off the polished marble floors. Noelle stood at the head of the dais, her heart racing beneath a gown of shimmering silver and deep forest green, the colors of life enduring through the winter. As she looked out over the sea of faces, she saw no longer the suspicious eyes of nobles or the hollow stares of the hungry. Instead, she saw a kingdom beginning to heal. Silas, magnificent in his ceremonial golden black armor, took the heavy platinum circlet from its velvet cushion. His hands were steady as he lowered it onto her head, his eyes locking onto hers with that familiar, golden heat. "I crown you Queen Noelle," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Protector of the realm, voice of the people, and heart of the king. The roar that followed was deafening. Noelle felt the weight of the crown, not as a burden, but as a promise. After the ceremony, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the king and queen slipped away from the royal banquet. Cloaked in heavy furs, they walked through the town square to the grand Christmas tree. It was no longer just a decoration, it had become a sacred site. The base of the tree was piled high with warm blankets, baskets of food, and hand-carved toys, gifts left by those who had plenty for those who had nothing. Noelle paused to adjust a small wooden wolf that had fallen over, her hand lingering for a moment on her stomach. It was a secret she and Silas shared, a new life, a new era, beginning in the quiet of the winter. Nearby stood the newly finished Noelle Winter Academy, its windows glowing with warmth. In its halls, the children of high-ranking dukes sat beside the orphans of the street, learning not just letters and law, but the history of the winter mages and the power of equality. As the first flakes of snow began to drift from the violet sky, the square emptied, leaving Silas and Noelle alone before the shimmering tree. The silence was peaceful, broken only by the distant sound of carols from the palace. "What are you wishing for this year?" Silas asked, pulling her back against his chest and wrapping his arms around her. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her cheek. Noelle leaned back into him, watching the way the snow caught the light of the ornaments. She thought of the threadbare cloak she had worn a year ago, the hunger that had once been her constant companion, and the dying puppy she had found in the cold. She thought of the magic in her blood and the man who had seen her when she was invisible. "Nothing," she whispered, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I already have everything." Silas turned her in his arms, his expression tender. The fierce Alpha King was nowhere to be seen, replaced entirely by the man who had found his home in her. "I love you, Noelle." "I love you too," she replied, reaching up to brush a stray snowflake from his dark hair. "My king. My Christmas miracle." He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep seal of their bond as the tree behind them glowed with a soft, pulse-like silver light. The camera of the mind pulls back then, rising above the square, above the palace, and over the sprawling kingdom. Below, the lights of 1,000 homes twinkle like stars fallen to earth. Families sit together around warm hearths, children sleep safely in their beds, and the shadows that once haunted the borders have been chased away by the dawn of a new era. And so the kingdom learned that sometimes the greatest magic isn't power, it's love. And sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones brave enough to be kind when the world demands cruelty. This Christmas miracle wasn't just about saving a king. It was about remembering that we all deserve to be saved. That every act of compassion matters. That kindness can change kingdoms. And that sometimes, when you open your heart on the coldest night of the year, magic finds its way in. The end. I hope you enjoyed this journey from the snowy cottage to the royal throne. Which country are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed Noelle and Silas's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more interesting alpha werewolf and shifter tales coming your way that you won't want to miss. See you in the next story.